The file was brittle before I even opened it. Paper browned, edges sharp with age, like the case itself was cutting back at anyone who tried to touch it. The heading read Fall River Police Department. Homicide, August 4th, 1892. I'd studied hundreds of such folders, but this one carried a kind of superstition in its dust. The murders of Andrew and Abby Borden were not unsolved. They were merely unresolved, which is worse. The first photograph was the parlor. A small horsehair sofa, a man's body collapsed half sideways, coat removed, boots still on. The caption beneath, in copperplate handwriting, said only Mr. A. J. Borden, found deceased, 11:15 a.m. His face was a map of violence rendered by repetition, not frenzy. Whoever swung the hatchet had done it with focus, each strike identical in aim, as if precision had replaced mercy. The second photograph showed the upstairs guest room. There lay Mrs. Abby Borden between the bed and the dresser, face down, the back of her skull collapsed inward. I paused at the margin note, estimated interval between deaths, approximate 90 minutes. That meant whoever killed one had stayed in that house long enough to wait for the other. I turned the page to the witness statements. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, pale, nauseated. Mrs. Churchill, the neighbor, frantic. And at the center of it all, Miss Lizzie Andrew Borden, 32 years old, unmarried, described by every reporter as dutiful, devoted, and dry as salt. The ink was still legible where she'd said, "I was in the barn, sir, looking for sinkers for a fishing trip." In 30 years of studying murder, I'd never known a statement so careful in its ordinariness. The Borden house still stands on 2nd Street, its clapboards painted a weary green now, though photographs from the time show them white, nearly reflective in summer glare. When I visited the archive, they'd saved the original floor plan, a narrow, almost miserly construction, every room pressed tight against the next. It wasn't a house built for secrets, and yet it held them perfectly. The first floor opened into the parlor where Andrew died, the dining room behind it, and a cramped kitchen leading to the barn. The staircase, narrow as a throat, split halfway, one flight to the guest room above where Abby's body was found, another leading up to Liz's and Emma's rooms. The women's chambers were separated from their parents by a door that had been locked for months, Andrew's insistence, after a series of small domestic disputes. The papers described the household as respectable, withdrawn, and devout, but local recollections paint a different picture. Andrew was frugal to cruelty, Abby was resented as an interloper, and the daughters, especially Lizzie, felt trapped between propriety and decay. There was money, yes, but no warmth. The servants called the house tight, not for its dimensions but its air, cold in winter, airless in summer, and never touched by music. Lizzie had been seen in town days before the murders buying prussic acid from a pharmacist, a detail later dismissed as irrelevant. Still, her composure on the morning of August 4th troubled the coroner enough to note, Miss Borden exhibited no hysteria beyond what politeness might require. Even now, reading that line under fluorescent light, I felt it, that peculiar chill of someone who knows they're being watched and performs grief by the rules, not the heart. Every case leaves an odor in its pages. This one smells of absence more than blood. The morning of August 4th began like any other in the Borden household, at least on paper. The servant, Bridget Sullivan, rose before 6 to light the stove and prepare breakfast. Andrew took his customary seat at the head of the dining table, reading the Fall River Globe while Abby moved between the stove and pantry. Lizzie came down late, declining the meal, claiming her stomach wasn't right. Emma, the elder sister, was away visiting friends in Fairhaven, a detail that would later seem either providential or deliberate. According to Bridget's statement, Andrew left around 9 a.m. for his usual errands downtown. Abby went upstairs to make the guest bed where her brother-in-law had slept the night before. Lizzie told Bridget she intended to iron handkerchiefs, a small domestic detail that would appear in every newspaper headline as if it held the key to the murders. By 10:45 a.m., Andrew had returned, complaining of the front door's stiffness. Bridget helped him inside and then retreated to her room on the 3rd floor to lie down. She had been vomiting all morning. The household was said to have eaten spoiled mutton earlier that week. The next noise she remembered was Lizzie calling from downstairs, "Maggie, come quick. Father's dead." Someone came in and killed him. When she reached the parlor, the world seemed reduced to stillness and flies. Police arrived within 20 minutes. Neighbors crowded the front steps within 5. The newspapers later marveled at how efficiently horror drew spectators. Yet amid all that commotion, no one heard a scream. No one saw a stranger enter or leave. The hatchet blows had occurred in a vacuum of sound and time. It was as if the house itself had closed its throat around the violence and refused to let it out. That silence would become the prosecution's greatest mystery, and Lizzie Borden's greatest defense. The first inconsistencies were small, but small things in murder cases are like cracks in plaster. You only have to tap once for the wall to give way. Lizzie told Officer Medley she'd been in the barn loft, looking for lead sinkers for a fishing line, when she heard a strange sound, like a groan or scraping. She claimed to have come back into the house moments later and found her father slain. But the temperature that morning had climbed past 90. When Medley inspected the barn, the dust on the floorboards was unbroken, the air heavy with heat, and no fresh footprints marked the boards where she claimed to have stood. Worse, her explanation for why she'd gone to the loft shifted with each telling. To one neighbor she said she was searching for iron. To another, she said she was reading an old magazine to cool off. When questioned again about Abby's whereabouts, she first said her stepmother had gone out with a note from a sick friend, then later that she thought Abby had gone upstairs to make the bed. The contradictions nested inside each other, deliberate or careless, no one could say. What struck me most in the transcripts wasn't the content but the tone. Liz's words were clean, almost mathematical, as if she understood that uncertainty could be a shield. The detectives, untrained in psychology, focused instead on the tangible. They searched for bloody clothes, footprints, strangers seen loitering nearby. They found none. Only later, when a police matron observed Lizzie burn a stained dress in the kitchen stove, a paint dress, she called it, did anyone grasp how swiftly evidence can vanish under the guise of housekeeping. Reading that note in the file, I could almost hear the sound of fabric turning to ash, the way guilt sometimes announces itself not through confession, but through the neatness of what's destroyed. The autopsy reports were handwritten in the deliberate cursive of the late 19th century, measured, restrained, and terrible in their precision. Dr. Dolan, the county medical examiner, performed both postmortems on the kitchen table that very afternoon. The file includes a photograph I wish it didn't, Abby Borden's hair parted by violence rather than comb. The report reads, wounds inflicted from rear, probable position of assailant elevated above victim. That phrase told investigators that Abby had likely been struck first while facing away, perhaps making the guest bed. Her death was instant. Andrew's wounds, by contrast, were fewer but more deliberate, each delivered with mechanical accuracy, as though the killer paused between strikes to check the work. Dolan noted that no defensive marks existed on either body. No struggle, no overturned furniture, no footprints in blood leading outward. Just 2 deaths performed within the same small house, separated by 90 minutes, and an impossible calm in between. The hatchet recovered in the cellar, its handle freshly broken, was cleaned almost too well. Under a magnifying lens, only a dark smudge remained. When Dolan compared skull fragments to the weapon, the curvature aligned. The blow had come from someone familiar with anatomy or practice, someone who understood that death could be efficient if one was patient. Reading that sentence aloud in my study, I found myself picturing the precision, the calculation, and wondering not who could do such a thing, but who could wait in silence after doing it. The house yielded nothing else, no sign of forced entry, no theft, no footprints beyond family. If a stranger had committed the murders, he had entered and vanished as air. If someone inside had done it, then everything that followed, the calm, the tears, the story about the barn, wasn't shock. It was rehearsal. The inquest was held 3 days after the murders in the stuffy chambers of City Hall, where the August heat pressed against every pane of glass. The stenographer's notes capture not just Liz's answers but the rhythm of her pauses, marked with small ellipses that read now like stage directions. She arrived without counsel, an odd confidence for a woman soon to be the most suspected in the country. When asked about her whereabouts that morning, she spoke plainly, "I was in the barn." When asked how long, she said, "About 20 minutes, maybe half an hour." When asked if she'd heard a thud or cry, she replied, "I did not." Then came the contradictions. Her timeline wavered with each retelling, her certainty softened. At one point she claimed her father had a strange look upon entering, that he seemed as if he wanted to lie down. Another time she insisted he'd said nothing at all. What disturbed the examiner most wasn't her inconsistency but her serenity. A witness described her as composed as a clerk reading figures. The transcript notes that she smiled once, faintly, when asked whether she had enemies. "I have none," she said, "except those who may think me guilty." The coroner pressed her about the locked door between her and Abby's room, about the alleged note Abby received that morning. No such note was ever found. I paused on that page of the file, tracing the indentation left by the clerk's pen. You can tell when an investigator is losing patience. The handwriting sharpens, angles harden. By the final page, even the questions seem exhausted, the ink itself thinning as if drained by futility. Lizzie was released without charge that day, but by nightfall every newspaper from Boston to New York carried her face on the front page. The paradox of Miss Borden, one headline read, "Virtue or Villainy in Fall River." The country devoured the story before the courts ever could. Fall River became a stage, and Lizzie its reluctant, perhaps willing, actress. By the end of that week, reporters from Boston, New York, even Chicago had taken rooms in nearby inns, describing the quiet mill town as if it were a carnival of sin. Each newspaper framed her differently. The Globe called her the pious spinster of 2nd Street, while the Herald printed an engraving under the headline "Angel of Death" in linen. People wanted a spectacle, not an investigation. They lingered outside the house, tore ivy from its walls as souvenirs, wrote letters addressed simply to Miss Lizzie, murderess. And yet, among the chaos, small sympathies formed. The Women's Christian Temperance Union called her arrest an outrage against propriety. Ministers preached that no daughter raised in faith could wield a hatchet. The class divide was palpable. Fall River's working poor saw in Lizzie's calm an arrogance they recognized from the mills, while the city's elite defended her as one of their own, misunderstood and maligned. I found a letter in the archives written by a reporter who had attended one of her Sunday school lessons years before. He described her as quiet, punctual, not cruel, but curiously without mirth. That phrase lingered with me more than any blood evidence. Public opinion became its own verdict, splitting the nation long before the jury would. And through it all, Lizzie neither hid nor confessed. She attended her father's funeral, wearing black gloves, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. When asked by a journalist if she wished to say anything to the people accusing her, she replied, "They may think what they like. The truth will wait." It was not the denial of an innocent woman, it was the patience of someone certain the world would eventually exhaust itself. The arrest came quietly on the morning of August 11th, a full week after the murders. No procession, no protest, just a single officer, Marshal Hilliard, arriving at the house with a warrant folded into his coat. Lizzie was in the kitchen, the same place where the burned dress had vanished days before. She didn't resist, didn't weep, only asked, "Is this for appearance's sake, sir, or belief?" The marshal wrote in his notes that she said it without tremor. In custody, her inventory read like a widow's packing list: 1 Bible, 2 handkerchiefs, and a small key she refused to identify. At headquarters, the evidence was thin but theatrical: the broken handle hatchet, a dress allegedly burned by mistake, statements from neighbors who'd seen no stranger near the house. What the police did have was circumstance, motive, and manner. Circumstance: she was alone at the time of both murders. Motive: inheritance, half her father's estate, which he had long withheld. Manner: knowledge of the house's rhythms, the precision of each strike. But cases are not won by implication, and even in 1892, juries demanded proof. The district attorney ordered another search of the property. They dug the yard, drained the well, sifted the ashes in the stove. They found nothing. Still, when the coroner's jury convened, they deemed the evidence sufficient for probable guilt. Reading that line now, I can feel the hesitation behind the phrase, the way law tries to articulate suspicion without admitting it. Lizzie spent the next 10 months in jail awaiting trial, her meals brought in porcelain rather than tin, her cell lined with books. She wrote daily to Emma, who answered only in scripture. The press called her the Sunday school slayer. The phrase stuck because it sounded impossible, and impossibility sells. The trial opened on June 5, 1893, inside the grand oak courtroom of New Bedford Superior Court, a setting more befitting a sermon than a murder. I've read the full transcript twice now, each time struck by how quickly formality turns into theatre when the audience is the nation itself. Lizzie arrived dressed in black silk, her hair neatly coiled, face pale but composed. She carried a small bouquet of lilies, placed them on the defense table, and never touched them again. The prosecution began with photographs, grainy enlargements of the bodies, the parlor, the guest room. Reporters described jurors looking down rather than at them. The defense countered with character witnesses, neighbors, shopkeepers, teachers, all describing Lizzie as gentle, charitable, incapable of rage. Then came the detail that split the courtroom in two, the testimony about the burned dress. Alice Russell, a close friend of Lizzie's, said she had seen her tear the fabric, feed it into the stove, and remark that it was covered in paint. The word paint echoed through the courtroom like confession disguised as convenience. Yet without blood evidence or a witness to the act, it remained conjecture. Forensic science in 1893 was a vocabulary still being invented. Juries trusted demeanor over data. Liz's composure became her defense. When the prosecutor asked whether she had quarreled with her stepmother, her only reply was, "I did not love her, sir, but I did my duty." The line made every newspaper the next morning. Sitting in the archive today, I underlined it twice in my notes. It's the sort of phrase that tells you everything and nothing at once. Duty can hide many sins. Love, only one. By the end of that first week, the question was no longer whether Lizzie Borden had killed. It was whether she could. The twist arrived not from testimony but from anatomy. On the seventh day of trial, the prosecution brought forth a locked tin box sealed since the autopsies. Inside, beneath a square of linen, lay the skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden, cleaned, catalogued, and reassembled for the jury to see. Dr. Dolan placed them on the stand like exhibits from a museum of horror. The courtroom went still, even the pressmen set down their pens. Lizzie, until then motionless, turned pale, rose halfway from her chair, and fainted. Some called it shock, others theatre, but the reaction was genuine enough to halt proceedings. When she recovered, she asked for water, then whispered something to her attorney that no one recorded. I've stared at that page in the trial ledger, blank except for the note "defendant overcome." It's the only moment in the entire record where her control cracked. To see the literal bones of her family laid bare before strangers must have pierced whatever composure she'd built. Yet public sympathy shifted again. The sight was considered grotesque. Newspapers called it a barbarity disguised as evidence. By the next morning, even those convinced of her guilt questioned whether the state had gone too far. That's how thin the line is in historical memory. The moment pity replaces horror, verdicts change. The court recessed early that day, and outside, a crowd gathered not to condemn her, but to pray. As an investigator reading a century later, I find myself caught in the same snare, repelled by the violence, drawn by the mystery, uncertain where justice ends and performance begins. If this revelation shocked you as it did them, remember to subscribe to Glen. Every untold story brings us closer to the shadows of history. The defense began their counterstrike with the calm precision of men who knew narrative could outweigh evidence. Liz's attorney, George Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts, opened with a single sentence: "There is not one drop of blood to bind this woman to those acts." He leaned into the moral theater the prosecution had accidentally built, reminding jurors that no weapon, no witness, no confession, no trace of guilt existed beyond speculation. The courtroom, already weary of gore, seemed eager for a reprieve. Robinson painted the investigation as a failure of imagination, police obsessed with a woman's demeanor rather than the science of her innocence. He introduced testimony that Bridget, the maid, had been outside washing windows when the murders occurred, that any man could have slipped through the side door unnoticed. He questioned why the police had failed to secure the house before reporters swarmed it, contaminating what little physical proof existed. The hatchet? Too clean, he said. The timeline? Too convenient. And then he turned to the jury, softening his tone. She is a Sunday school teacher, a daughter, a woman who has lived with devotion, accused because she did not faint loudly enough. The phrasing was deliberate, an appeal not to fact but to Victorian decency. In that instant, Liz's gender became her shield. Public opinion, once ravenous for guilt, shifted toward pity again. The courtroom sketch that appeared in the Boston Globe the next morning showed her framed by light from a high window, the caption reading "Grace on Trial." I've seen that illustration in 3 separate archives. Its beauty feels unearned, like forgiveness granted before sin is proven. But it worked. By the end of the day, jurors were no longer leaning forward in suspicion, they were leaning back in fatigue, as if the prosecution's case had already overstayed its welcome. The final days of the trial unfolded like the quiet tapering of a storm. The prosecution, cornered by its own lack of evidence, resorted to moral insistence. They spoke of duty, of filial betrayal, of unnatural calm. The defense answered with absence: no blood, no prints, no witness, no motive sufficient for madness. Each side repeated itself until words lost meaning. The jurors, 12 men chosen for their God-fearing reputations, sat unspeaking through it all, their eyes glazed by repetition and the oppressive June heat. On the morning of June 20th, Lizzie's counsel delivered closing arguments that were less plea than benediction. "Gentlemen," Robinson said, "we live in a country of proof, not prejudice." He gestured toward Lizzie, small, pale, still. To condemn her without seeing the act would be to hang half the women of this commonwealth. It was eloquence as shield, and it worked. When the jury retired to deliberate, reporters timed them. 1 hour and 10 minutes later, they returned. The foreman's voice was steady, not guilty. The crowd erupted, women wept, men applauded. Lizzie herself whispered, "I am innocent," and the judge nodded as if the words were ritual rather than relief. But what haunts the record isn't the verdict, it's what followed. As she left the courthouse, sunlight struck her face for the first time in months, and she smiled. Every camera in range captured it. That photograph became the new emblem of the case, not a monster's smirk, but a survivor's. Yet the smile was too brief, too knowing, as if she understood something the rest of them never would. That guilt, once spoken by the world, never fades entirely, even when law absolves it. From that moment, Lizzie Borden was free in name only. Freedom, it turned out, was lonelier than confinement. Lizzie returned to Fall River that summer beneath the same stairs that had followed her out of the courtroom. The house on 2nd Street had become an exhibit. Children dared one another to touch its gate. Tourists took fragments of its fence as trophies. Within weeks, she and her sister Emma left it behind and purchased a larger home on the hill, the wealthy district their father had once refused to join. She renamed it Maplecroft, as if language alone could distance her from what had happened. The town disagreed. Churches refused her tithes. The shops that once welcomed her closed doors in silence. At the theatre, whispers preceded her entrance. At Sunday service, pews emptied when she sat down. Fall River had forgiven the verdict, not the spectacle. Emma tolerated it for nearly a decade before leaving suddenly in 1905. No explanation, no reconciliation. Her departure marked the true verdict of the family: separation, not acquittal. Alone, Lizzie filled her house with company she could control: actors, musicians, stray acquaintances from Providence. The neighbors called it indecent. The papers called it a masquerade. I found a clipping from 1913 titled "Miss Borden's Curious Evenings," describing her as gracious, remote, attended by laughter that seldom touched her eyes. Even in solitude, she was observed. Even in comfort, she was haunted by the geometry of that old house: the tight corners, the stairs that creaked in sequence, the locked door between love and blood. She never married, never sold Maplecroft, and never again spoke her father's name in public. The law had freed her, but the world had chosen exile. In truth, they amount to the same sentence. The later years of Lizzie Borden's life read like a long footnote written in diminishing ink. Public record shows fewer appearances, fewer letters, and an increasing solitude broken only by her servants and the occasional journalist who managed to slip past her gate. In 1918, she contracted gallbladder disease, a quiet agony that went untreated for months because she refused to see doctors in Fall River. "They'll open me up just to look for ghosts," she told one companion, a line that reveals both paranoia and poetry. Her finances remained healthy. Her investments in textile stock and property rentals ensured comfort. Yet the expense ledger I found among probate papers tells a stranger story. Dozens of entries marked simply private, to Boston, cash. No receipts, no context. Rumor held she had begun consulting spiritualists, women who claimed they could speak with the dead, or with those who might not have been dead at all. One local account described a trunk delivered weekly to Maplecroft containing small vials and books bound in faded blue leather. Nothing illegal, just unusual, like a woman trying to rewrite the afterlife's rules to include an appeal. Whether or not she believed in ghosts, Fall River believed in hers. Children sang the rhyme, Lizzie Borden took an axe, in the streets until it became folklore. Teachers corrected them, priests disapproved, but the chant endured. It was catchy, cruel, and self-perpetuating. The irony is that no court ever proved she used an axe at all. The weapon itself remained a question, a placeholder for human certainty. Reading those probate notes, I realized that history often prefers rhyme to record. Truth is harder to hum. Lizzie Borden died on June 1, 1927, at Maplecroft, after a brief illness brought on by pneumonia. There was no nurse present, no family at her bedside. Only a housekeeper heard the final cough, described later as a sigh that startled the silence. Emma, estranged for over 20 years, died just 9 days later in New Hampshire, never knowing her sister had gone first. The newspapers reported the coincidence with poetic efficiency, the Borden sisters reunited in death. The funeral was small, held at the Rock Street Cemetery Chapel, the same place their father and stepmother had been laid 35 years before. The surviving relatives insisted that no reporters be allowed, but Fall River has always preferred rumor to respect. Someone leaked a photograph of the caskets, side by side, labeled simply Miss Lizzie A. Borden and Miss Emma L. Borden. The rhyme resurfaced, printed again as if to close the circle. Yet what struck me in the probate ledger was not her wealth, over $250,000, an enormous sum, but her final bequests, money to the Animal Rescue League, to servants, to a church that had long refused her pew. Nothing for family, nothing for legacy. It felt like an apology written in code. When the estate lawyer closed the file, he added a note that history nearly missed: house well kept, walls freshly painted, mirrors shrouded. That last detail unsettled me, the mirrors covered, as though even reflection had become unbearable. With her death, the house at 2nd Street passed quietly into new ownership, yet no tenant stayed long. The record shows a rotation of renters, each lasting only a season. They complained of footsteps, drafts, and the sense that someone still occupied the rooms between them. Maybe that's just the imagination inheriting what the law could not resolve. Either way, the house endured, waiting for its next investigation. The deeper I read into the preserved records, the less they resembled evidence and the more they looked like something curated, a performance of investigation, not its reality. Handwriting changed mid-report, dates crossed out and rewritten, signatures missing from key statements. One entire page of Bridget Sullivan's testimony was duplicated, word for word, but the ink density differed, as if recopied weeks later. More troubling were the gaps. 2 photographs referenced in the crime log, the hatchet on the cellar table and a close-up of Andrew's wound pattern, no longer exist in any archive. They're simply gone, leaving only typed captions and the faint square outlines where they once were glued. Archivists shrug, they call it deterioration, water damage, lost through time. But time doesn't select its victims so neatly. It doesn't erase only what could still accuse. Then I found something stranger, a marginal note in the clerk's ledger, dated October 1892, a month after Liz's arrest, per Sheriff H., photographs to be returned to private counsel upon request. No such counsel is listed. The line is initialed only with a sharp E. I traced the ink, thicker than the rest, as if written in haste. Was evidence removed to protect the department, or someone within it? The Borden case was the first major test of modern forensics in Massachusetts. A public failure would have meant disgrace. It's not inconceivable that the police, desperate to preserve dignity, quietly unmade the proof that might have justified their suspicions. The thought unsettled me. Maybe the mystery of Lizzie Borden isn't whether she killed, but whether the machinery built to prove it quietly decided it was safer not to know. Because sometimes, in history, the absence of truth is the most deliberate artifact of all. It took me weeks to find it, the missing thread that had been disguised as administrative dust. In a quiet annex of the Bristol County Historical Society, buried behind probate files and shipping ledgers, a box marked Private Correspondence, 1892 weighted without catalogue entry. Inside lay what appeared to be mundane county paperwork, until a smaller envelope surfaced, cream paper, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The seal bore the initials E.H., Sheriff Alicia Hilliard. Inside were 3 photographs, curling at the edges, the emulsion still faintly smelling of silver nitrate. The first was of the cellar workbench, a hatchet head, no handle, resting on a folded scrap of muslin. The second showed the kitchen stove, door ajar, ash spilling like spilled flour. The third, barely legible, was a close-up of a woman's arm from shoulder to wrist, skin faintly marked with what looked like tiny circular bruises. On the back of this last photograph, in faded pencil, someone had written left forearm, Miss A.B. I knew Abby Borden had been found face down, her sleeves rolled. The autopsy report never mentioned bruising. The spacing of those marks, when scaled against the photo, matched the prongs of the kitchen fire tongs. This was no accident. This was restraint. Yet nowhere in the trial transcripts, nowhere in the coroner's testimony, is there reference to such marks. They'd been omitted, excised like an inconvenient detail. Why? The simplest explanation is always discomfort. Polite society refused to imagine domestic violence from within a pious home. But part of me suspects the omission served another master, to protect the image of the investigation itself, to simplify the story into villain and victim, sinner and saint. Complexity rarely sells newspapers. The past prefers its monsters tidy. But holding that photograph under archival light, I realized what terrified me most wasn't what had been done, it was what had been erased to make the story easier to tell. The photograph of Abby's arm refused to leave my mind. When magnified under the scanner's lens, the bruises weren't random, they formed 2 distinct rows, spaced evenly, as if someone had gripped and twisted the flesh with metal. Not the frenzy of attack, but control. I cross-referenced the autopsy sketches and discovered an odd note in the margin of Dr. Dolan's report, ligature marks uncertain, possibly post-mortem. That line had been struck through, initialed again by H. It was then I began to see the case differently. The official record built its horror around suddenness, a daughter's fit of madness, 2 quick deaths. But the physical evidence whispered of sequence, of restraint, of a crime with more patience than passion. If Abby had been subdued before she was struck, someone else had held her still. The implication was poisonous. Either Lizzie did not act alone, or she was not the hand that struck first. There were rumors at the time, unpublished, that a man had been seen around the property days before the killings, a handyman dismissed for impertinence. His name appears once in the police ledger, then vanishes from every subsequent file. The line referencing him was scratched out so roughly that it tore the paper. The archivist assumed water damage. I call it censorship. I followed the trail to the 1892 census records and found one laborer, Irish, age 25, listed at the Borden address for a single month. No date of departure, no next of kin. A ghost with payroll. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps not. But the pattern was familiar. When history becomes uncomfortable, it edits itself into myth. We wanted Lizzie to be either innocent or monstrous. Anything in between, collusion, coercion, the mess of shared guilt, was too human to endure. In truth, that's where horror always hides, not in the act, but in the partnership that silence protects. I found the missing statement in the least likely place, tucked inside a folder labeled Miscellaneous Depositions, not entered. It wasn't a deposition in the legal sense. It was a letter, unsigned, dated August 6, 1892, 2 days after the murders. The handwriting was careful, educated, and unfamiliar. It read, "I saw a man at the side gate between 10:30 and 11. He carried something wrapped in cloth. I did not speak for fear of offense, as he appeared to know the way." That was all. No name, no address, no follow-up. But the ink had bled slightly, and beneath it, faint as breath, someone had penciled the initials B.S. Bridget Sullivan. The maid. Her formal testimony never mentioned a man at the gate, only chores, illness, and the sound of Liz's call. If she had seen someone that morning, why omit it? I compared the letter's stationery to others in the file, identical watermark, same county supply. It had been received by the department and filed away deliberately, but its absence from the trial record suggests one of 2 things: disbelief or suppression. The police, already confident in their theory, may have disregarded it as hysteria, or they knew a stranger's presence would unravel the logic of domestic tragedy the press had made so profitable. I sat back in the archive's dim light, reading the words again, and realized how fragile truth becomes once filtered through institution. A single unsigned letter could have changed everything. It could have split the story open, turned public sympathy, altered verdicts, rewritten rhyme. Instead, it was folded, filed, and forgotten. Sometimes a whole century rests on one clerk's decision about what to keep in the box, and what to leave in the dark. History, I've learned, isn't written by survivors, it's edited by publishers. Once the letter vanished and the photographs went missing, the story crystallized into something simpler, marketable, permanent. Lizzie ceased to be a suspect and became an idea. Within a year of her acquittal, ballads were circulating in New England taverns, the rhyme polished into a child's chant. The newspapers printed caricatures of her face beside hatchets sold as novelty letter openers. The nation wanted a parable about evil that could wear a corset. Every retelling made the case neater, cleaner, crueler. The complex tangle of class, gender, and evidence collapsed into 8 sing-song lines that rhymed 40 with shorty. The investigator in me wants to trace the first appearance of that rhyme, but no one owns it. It drifted through decades like a confession made by a crowd. Fall River's official records call the murders solved by jury, unsolved by conscience. They're right. Every archive I've visited since keeps the Borden file in a glass case, not for preservation, but for spectacle. A curator once told me, half smiling, that the public prefers the myth because it's shorter to read. That sentence hit harder than any evidence I'd seen. The truth isn't lost, it's buried under convenience. The legend of Lizzie Borden endures because it flatters our sense of moral distance. We point at her and see a century safely passed. But these files tell me otherwise. They tell me the machinery that shaped her story, the biases, the edits, the profitable simplifications, is still humming today. And maybe that's why I keep reading, tracing, reopening the case. Not to clear her name, but to understand how innocence can become horror once the world decides it's a better story that way. The house at 92, 2nd Street stands now as a museum, its rooms restored to 1892 as faithfully as furniture and imagination allow. I arrived just after closing, escorted by a curator who had memorized the script for tourists but not the silences between his sentences. The parlor where Andrew died still holds the sofa, reupholstered, though the angle of the frame remains exact. Upstairs, the guest room's wallpaper curls faintly at the seam, like a wound never sealed. Every board beneath my feet seemed to breathe. I'd brought with me copies of the original photographs, printed in the same size as the walls they once recorded. When I matched them to the present, every detail aligned, the dresser, the clock, the lampstand. Only the air felt altered, thinner, emptied by repetition. Ghost stories cling to the place now, told by guides for tips, footsteps, weeping, a cold draft through the locked door between Lizzie's and her parents' rooms. None of that interests me. What does is the architecture itself. The stairs from the front hall rise straight into the guest room's doorway. From that angle, anyone climbing would have seen Abby's body the moment it fell. Yet Bridget, called by Liz's voice, swore she saw nothing until after the fact. I stood there for a long time, calculating line of sight, distance, sound. Even with the doors shut, a body falling would echo. A hatchet striking twice, thrice, it would shake the glass. So what did Bridget hear? What did she choose not to? The curator cleared his throat, he was ready to lock up. As I left, I turned back once. Through the window's reflection, I could see my own outline where Lizzie had once stood calling the maid. For a second, I couldn't tell whether I was studying the house or it was studying me. The rational mind insists on order, on evidence, cause, consequence, but the longer I lived with this case, the more it began to unmake that structure inside me. At night, I'd hear the soft turning of paper in my office, though no window was open. The photographs stayed spread across my desk, faces inverted beneath the lamplight like negatives developing themselves. It wasn't superstition that unnerved me, it was comprehension. The more patterns I found, the more they dissolved into questions that led nowhere. Why would an investigator erase proof? Why would a witness silence herself? And why, even acquitted, did Lizzie never leave the orbit of her own crime? The psychological texts of her time called it moral insanity, a polite term for emptiness where empathy should reside. But I wonder now if that emptiness wasn't just hers. The city profited from the deaths, the newspapers turned murder into melody, the law satisfied itself with a verdict that tidied the record. Perhaps guilt, like inheritance, had simply divided itself among them all. I began to dream of the Borden house, not as it was, but as an idea. The rooms kept changing, doors multiplying, each leading back into another transcript, another omission. The human mind, given too long with unanswered questions, starts to build architecture out of them. I realized that I wasn't researching anymore, I was rehearsing. The same way Lizzie might have rehearsed her answers, the same way the court rehearsed its justice. A century later, the ritual continues. Open the file, repeat the questions, find no truth, and close it again with relief disguised as closure. That repetition is what haunts me, not the blood, not the axe, but the orderliness of forgetting. It was after midnight when I found it, a name that should not have existed. I'd been cataloguing my notes, aligning transcript pages with police inventories, when one sheet slipped free and fell under the desk. It was a carbon copy of a property ledger, dated August 12, 1892, stamped received, County Treasurer. In faint blue pencil, beneath the official entries, was an annotation, payment rendered to Officer J.T. Harrington for removal of sensitive materials, per council. I froze. Harrington had been one of the first men on the scene, the deputy who collected the photographs and tagged the hatchet. No such payment appears in payroll archives. I flipped the page. Attached to it, by a rusted pin, was a single receipt from a Boston law firm, Reed & Coleman, known for representing the state in civil suits. The signature below was neither of theirs. It read E. Hilliard, the same sheriff whose initials marked the missing photograph note. The transaction was small, $50, but in 1892, that was half a month's wages. My pulse quickened not because I'd found corruption. Corruption is ordinary. It was the motive that unsettled me. If evidence had been quietly purchased out of the record, someone had paid to preserve the myth, not the truth. I checked the sequence numbers of the photographs listed on the back of the receipt. They matched the two missing prints. Somewhere between the courthouse and the archive, those images had changed hands, their absence notarized into obscurity. I realized then that the case was never about Liz's guilt, it was about control. Control over narrative, reputation, legacy. Fall River had needed a monster, the law had needed a victory, and the line between them was bought, documented, and buried under a clerk's careless pin. There's a moment in every investigation when discovery stops feeling like triumph and begins to feel like trespass. Holding that receipt, I understood I'd crossed that line. The signatures, the omissions, the vanished evidence, all of it formed a pattern older than Lizzie Borden and wider than Fall River. This wasn't a case, it was a rehearsal for modern justice. Tidy, performative, profitable. The authorities hadn't merely failed to solve the murders, they had edited them into a palatable myth that could survive public consumption. A woman on trial for parricide was sensational enough. Institutional negligence was not. The story had been streamlined to preserve faith in the system itself. Reading through the sheriff's subsequent correspondence confirmed it. In one letter, dated months after the acquittal, he wrote to a Boston editor, "Best not to revisit old wounds. The public requires peace more than proof." Peace more than proof. There it was, the quiet motto of every society that would rather forget than reconcile. The same instinct that led Fall River to ostracize Lizzie while absolving itself. And maybe that's why the rhyme endured. It transformed unease into entertainment. I placed the receipt beside the photograph of Abby's arm and realized they belonged to the same archive of evasion. One physical, one moral. Each told of something restrained, silenced for decorum's sake. In the dim glow of the desk lamp, the papers seemed to breathe, curling slightly as if reacting to exposure. I thought about sealing them back up, returning them to their box, leaving the legend intact. But once you've seen the scaffolding behind the story, you can't pretend the stage is solid anymore. You either look away, or keep digging, knowing the truth has been waiting, patient, for someone willing to disturb the peace. Sheriff Hilliard's private letters were never meant to surface. I found them bound in a faded brown envelope misfiled among tax rolls from 1894, pages written in a slanted, exhausted hand that confessed more through omission than ink. The first was addressed to R.C., most likely the same Boston counsel listed on the payment receipt. It read, "The matter has been settled as quietly as one could hope. The images are not to be printed. Miss B.'s composure, though unseemly, spares us all embarrassment. Let it stand as providence rather than proof." Another, unsigned but bearing the sheriff's distinct H, followed weeks later. "There are things a woman will do in silence that no court could rightly punish. She bore the sight of her father's cruelty longer than we bore the sight of her trial. I have destroyed what remained." The line chilled me, not because it confirmed her guilt, but because it recast her silence as complicity between accuser and accused. If the sheriff believed she had cause, and the courts believed she lacked evidence, then justice became a negotiation of sympathy. Reading those words, I understood why the bruises on Abby's arm vanished from the record, to keep the story from shifting its moral center. A violent husband, a desperate daughter, a household built on restraint, too complicated for public digestion. The law chose purity over truth. I sat back in the archive's half-light, pages trembling between my fingers, realizing that what had been preserved for a century wasn't evidence. It was an alibi for everyone involved. Liz's silence had been convenient not only for herself, but for a town, a church, and a justice system unwilling to face what her story really was. Not madness, but reprisal, approved by omission. By the time dawn crept across the archive windows, I could no longer tell where research ended and confession began. The quiet hum of the dehumidifier sounded like a heartbeat, slow and labored. I sat there with Hilliard's letter spread open beside the faded photograph of Abby's bruised arm, the air heavy with the musk of paper and guilt. Every word I'd uncovered dismantled the separation I'd believed existed between history and its witnesses. We always assume the past is inert, that we can study it without consequence, but the moment you disturb its lies, it studies you back. My notes had become chaotic, margins filled with phrases that weren't analysis but intrusion. Who decides innocence? How many crimes end in applause? When does silence become mercy? I wasn't supposed to care about these people. They were dates, evidence, archetypes. Yet somewhere between the sheriff's confession and Liz's enduring calm, I felt an empathy that frightened me. Not for the murders, but for the exhaustion of being seen only as symbol. Lizzie had been tried once by law and forever by imagination. The men who shielded her weren't exonerating, they were curating her. And I, a century later, was doing the same, rearranging fragments into coherence because the truth's disorder terrified me. The moral vacuum of the case wasn't her act, it was the comfort we take in not knowing. The Borden house, the rhyme, the legend, all function as our collective excuse to avoid the question. What does justice look like when the truth no longer fits the story? I closed the box but couldn't bring myself to lock it. The air felt thick, the way attics do before storms. In that silence, I thought I heard something shift, just a sigh, maybe the archive's old beams settling, or maybe history exhaling at being seen again. Fall River greets you with the same mills, the same river fog, and a politeness that tastes faintly of denial. I went there to close the circle, to see how a town that once begged to forget now thrives on remembrance. The Borden house, I discovered, has been reborn as a bed and breakfast. Visitors pay to sleep in the murder room, to pose on the replica sofa, to purchase souvenir hatchets in the gift shop downstairs. The guide, a young woman dressed in 1890s morning black, told her stories with a practiced hush, each pause designed to let fear echo before laughter follows. Outside, the street bears a small plaque, site of the 1892 Borden murders. Nothing else. No mention of corruption, no hint of omission, no whisper of a system that chose silence over truth. I spoke with an elderly local named Margaret who remembered her grandmother's warnings, never cross that corner after dark. Liz is still looking for her stepmother. Even now, the myth breathes more easily than the facts. The local museum sells tea towels embroidered with the rhyme. Schoolchildren recite it at Halloween assemblies. Every retail window I passed displayed the same faded face, calm, clean, eternal. Fall River turned guilt into economy. Standing there, I realized the town hadn't forgiven Lizzie, it had absorbed her. She'd become its currency, the patron saint of unresolved sins. Tourists leave with keychains, photographs, stories. The town remains, quietly feeding on the fascination. I bought nothing. Walking back toward the river, I looked at the water's surface, thick, slow, metallic, and saw the reflection of the old mills trembling beneath the current. History was still working here, grinding innocence and profit together like grist. The machinery never stopped, it only changed its purpose. Exposure isn't justice. It's only light, brief, blinding, and indifferent. Back in my apartment, the documents lay in neat stacks across the table, every secret catalogued, every gap accounted for, yet none of it felt like resolution. I'd proven that evidence had been removed, that the sheriff had acted in quiet conspiracy, that the myth of Lizzie Borden was sculpted as much by fear as by fact, and still, the story resisted completion. The human need for endings is a dangerous instinct. It makes us invent where truth runs out. I began to see how the entire case functioned as a mirror, every generation reflecting its own unease through Lizzie's silhouette. For the Victorians, she embodied the threat of female autonomy. For the 20th century, the allure of scandal. For us, she's a warning about the stories we choose to believe because they're satisfying. The last time I handled her photograph, the original arrest print, I noticed something I hadn't before. Her eyes, slightly misaligned, one fixed ahead, the other turned a fraction toward the camera lens. It looked accidental, almost human, but that small asymmetry carried all the contradiction of her life. Two gazes, two truths, both existing at once. When I set it down, I realized that my obsession had begun to mirror the town's. I wasn't searching for innocence or guilt anymore. I was chasing the echo that remains when both have been stripped away, the hum of unanswered questions that won't stop vibrating beneath history's floorboards. Outside, the city lights flickered against the window, reflected faintly in the glass. For a heartbeat, they looked like candle flames, and behind them, a figure's outline in a house that never sleeps. The final report took me 3 nights to write, though it reads like something assembled in one breath. I began with the official phrasing, dates, sources, archival references, but the language quickly unraveled into confession. The case remains formally closed, I wrote, but not concluded. Every discovery I'd made had only replaced one void with another. I listed the missing photographs, the sheriff's letters, the erased witness statement. I detailed the quiet purchase of silence and the transformation of that silence into folklore. Yet as I typed, a realization grew heavy in my chest. The point was never whether Lizzie killed them. The true subject of the file, the reason it endures, is the anatomy of forgetting. How a society rehearses its own blindness until it feels like morality. The Borden murders became our national ghost story because they let us pretend evil has a face, a name, a rhyme, a rhythm that children can chant. That makes it safe, containable. But reading those old pages, I saw something far more intimate. Cruelty diffused across an entire town, across the men who looked away, the women who whispered, the jurors who wanted decency more than truth. That diffusion is what lasts. It's what every archive smells of, the dust of shared guilt. I sealed the report, printed 2 copies, and labeled one for the record, one for myself. Before locking it, I added a final line at the bottom of the page, unnumbered, unapproved. There are murders that end, and there are murders that continue indefinitely, disguised as history. Then I closed the box, the lamp, the night. The house in Fall River stayed where it was, quiet, waiting, its legend undisturbed. I returned the file to its shelf and stood for a long while in the dim corridor, the hum of the archive soft as breath. Around me stretched the silence of other stories, each one catalogued and sleeping beneath dust that passes for peace. The Borden case had begun as research, became obsession, and ended as mirror. We tell ourselves that time civilizes horror, that distance bleaches guilt, but that's another fiction, the kind that keeps history polite. Lizzie Borden never confessed, and the law never looked again, yet her silence keeps working in us, quietly asking what we would have done if the truth had been inconvenient to our comfort. That's the real inheritance of Fall River, not the crime, but the calm that followed it. Standing there, I could almost hear it, the faint creak of the old house, the echo of a woman's voice calling for help too late to sound convincing. Maybe that's how truth survives, as the sound you can't prove was there. I closed the lights one by one, and the last thing I saw was my reflection in the glass door, indistinct, double, like a photograph that's been exposed twice. For a second I thought I saw her face overlap mine, then the darkness took it back. Some files end with resolution, Others end by reminding you that resolution was never the point. The Borden case belongs to the latter. If you like this story, check out the ones on your screen. The dark algorithm thinks you'll enjoy these too.